Does God exist? And last week we talked about intuitively, we know that God exists from the standpoint that there's never been a time in history when any civilization that's ever existed that we have any recorded history of, they have worshipped a God of some kind. So from that standpoint alone, we can get the idea that it's a good evidence that there is a God. And tonight I want to talk about the cosmological argument. What is cosmological? Cosmos, everything around you. Cosmological has to do with things that... I'm going to start us with a verse of Scripture tonight. Job 38:4. It says, "Where were you when I established the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding. Who fixed its dimensions? Certainly you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? What supports its foundations? Or who laid its cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy." So who did that? Hebrews 3:4 says, "Now every house is built by someone, but the one who built everything is God." So this is telling us, and I'm going to do different quotes and different things, and we'll talk about different things as we're going here, but this, if you had never been in this community and you drove by and you saw this church, you saw this building here, would you assume that somebody built it? I mean, you would assume that somebody built it, put it together, made the structure, poured the foundation. Anything that you see, those tables there, the chairs you're sitting in, you didn't assume that they just happened somewhere sometime. There had to be some place where they came from, and you would assume right off the bat that somebody made them. The cosmological argument essentially says that the cosmos is here and it had to come from somewhere. That makes sense. It's just like they're talking about the building and the chairs and so on. We know it had to come from somewhere. At least we do. Some of the scientists and so on don't want to believe that God had anything to do with it or it came from anywhere. It could not have created itself. Nothing comes from nothing in nature. We know that's true. The famous philosopher from the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas, is generally given the credit for articulating what is known as the cosmological argument for the existence of God. And basically that's everything that is here, and we see all the things around them, and you read in Scripture it says all these things declare God and declare that there is God, that God exists. And we'll use that sometimes that we'll say, well, you see the sun out there, you see the plants growing and everything. Something has to account for that happening. And I just wanted to list this because this is one of the what science uses. The first law of thermodynamics says energy of a system and its surroundings remain constant. The law is also known as the law of conservation of energy, which states energy can transform from one form into another, but can neither be created nor destroyed within an isolated system. Perpetual motion machines of the first kind are impossible, according to the first law of thermodynamics. In other words, it is not possible to construct an engine that will cycle and produce work continuously from nothing. We know that from driving a car. Sooner or later it's going to run out of gas, even if you have an electric. I was reading an article, and don't quote me on this. They're talking, how they talk about electric cars are zero emission, and which is not really true when you have to figure all the manufacture and everything that goes into it. This one article says it takes 10 years to get it to where it's zero. So you have to have an electric car for 10 years before it basically pays for itself in emissions and things of that nature. That's what this article said. I'm not saying it's true. I don't know. I haven't done the research. But everything runs on something. The evidence from the natural realm indicates that every material effect must have an adequate antecedent cause. What is antecedent? That means something previous. I exist because of Hubert and Grace Jones. Hubert Jones existed because of Fred and Rugie Jones. Grace Jones existed because of Becton and Mildred Jones. So in other words, there was something that preceded it and that brought in, there was something that preceded us. There's something that preceded everything that there is. Even if you look at evolution and the theories of evolution and pretend there is no God, they go back to something else that caused something else that was caused by something else to get to where we are. So that's a given regardless of what you believe. And this is an example that's used. The mass of a paperclip is not going to provide sufficient gravitational pull to cause a tidal wave, right? It's going to take something a lot more serious than that in order to cause a tidal wave. Jumping up and down on the ground will not cause an earthquake. In other words, you have to have something that's powerful enough to create this. You have to have enough energy to create this. You have enough substance to create this. In other words, it's all made of something. These plants out here are growing right now, and Geneva said her garden is drying up and doesn't look like she's going to have much. But you plant a garden, and the plants produce, and you eat some of the produce from it, and the plants die. Do they cease to exist? No, they decay and they go back into the soil, which creates fertilizer and energy for the next crops that are coming up the next season. So it takes something. Everything is in a cycle here on this earth, and all the water that we're drinking today, they drank the same water 5,000 years ago. That makes you feel warm inside, but it's been cycled through human beings and animals and rain and soil and everything else for centuries, and it just has. That's the way things work here. If matter was not made and placed in the universe, we would not exist. That's pretty simple, isn't it? There must be an adequate antecedent or simultaneous cause for every material effect. Okay, I'm getting at a point here, so hopefully we'll get there. So I asked the question, is there a creator? And I answered the question by saying, is there a creation? So if there's a creation, then we could say there's a creator, because something had to create the creation that we have here. So you can ask, one of the best ways I've found, one of the best debate techniques that you can use, and not just when you're talking with somebody that's questioning you about your faith and so on, is what we want to do is we want to tell people what we think. What works better is if you ask questions. Somebody says, do you believe in God? And you could say, we wouldn't necessarily do it like this. You don't believe in God? Why do you not believe in God? In other words, instead of just saying, yes, I believe in God because, then you're done. But if you ask them, well, do you believe in God? You're asking me if I believe in God, do you believe in God? And they say, no, why don't you believe in God? What we do is we get on the defensive so many times that we want to give the answers instead of getting to the question that really matters to this particular person. And it helps us a good deal. So is there a creator? Is there a creation? If this law of cause and effect seems intuitive to you, then you understand why the cosmological argument is powerful, logical, positive evidence for the existence of God. The law of cause and effect, or law of principle of causality, has been investigated and recognized for millennia from at least the time of Plato and Aristotle in the 4th century BC, philosophers that pondered causality. Diana we were talking on the way home last Wednesday night, and she said, the only problem is you read so many quotes and things when you're doing this, but it's hard not to in order to get to the point where I want to get with this. So let's look at a few things that I want to read. In 1781, the renowned German philosopher Immanuel Kant wrote concerning the principle of causality in his Critique of Pure Reason that, now here's what he said, everything that happens presupposes a previous condition, which it follows with absolute certainty in conformity with a rule. All changes take place according to the law of the connection of cause and effect. Okay, that was in 1781. 19th century German medical scientist and father of cellular pathology. Now, that's not like a cellular telephone, that's cell like our cells. Cellular pathology, Rudolf Virchow, argued that everywhere there is mechanistic process only, try that again, everywhere there's mechanistic process only with the unbreakable necessity of cause and effect. In other words, it's there, it exists. In 1734, W.T. Stace, professor of philosophy, Princeton University, and a critical history of Greek philosophy, wrote this: every student of logic knows that this is the ultimate canon of the sciences, the foundation of them all. If we did not believe the truth of causation, namely, everything which has a beginning has a cause, and that in the same circumstances the same things invariably happen, all the sciences would at once crumble to dust. Now, what's he saying? He goes a long way around, but what's he saying? Cause and effect, but what's he saying? Look what the last thing he said there. He said, all the sciences would at once crumble to dust. In other words, if you couldn't study the cause and effect of things, there would be no science. There would be no way to investigate. There would be no way to look into things. Mac had surgery today. Why could he have that kind of surgery? Because somebody before this doctor worked on a process to get there, and somebody before him, and somebody before him, they studied. He had a course in anatomy at some time in his profession, and he knows what's in the human body. If he didn't, I wouldn't want him operating on me if he didn't know what was in there. So we have to, the cause and effect, we know that you have, why does a car run? Why does a car run, Tommy? So you got a combustion engine, and it runs on fuel, and when you creates an explosion that pushes down a piston that turns a drive shaft. In other words, there's something that creates the motion that makes this move. It's not all we know about it. Most of us, what we know about it is you turn the key and it cranks. But if somebody didn't think up that process and put it into motion, and if we haven't improved on that, where would we be now? They've improved so much that I had a 1989 Geo Metro that got 49 miles to the gallon. Now they've improved it so much you can get 35 miles to the gallon. So, because they've got a lot more junk on it than what they had back then. And I could get 49 miles to the gallon day in and day out with that Geo Metro back in 1989, little 3-cylinder. But anyway, they've changed, they've, quote, improved things. But all science depends on cause and effect. You have to have something to study to find out if it happened. The five main causes of evolution, according to evolutionists, are gene flow, genetic drift, mutation, natural selection, and recombination. Okay, people list them in different ways, but this is the 5 major ones, and I don't want to get in what each one of these is tonight, because that would get into some stuff that we really don't care to know anyway, but that's some of the reasons that they give and the main causes of evolution. And the ones you might recognize the most out of there is mutation and natural selection. You probably heard those. What's a mutation? What's a mutation? When I was a preteen, I remember we took a trip to the mountains. My grandma Rugi came with us, and we all took a trip to the mountains. And in fact, drove. My dad had bought a Triumph station wagon, 4-cylinder, and we drove it to the mountains. When he got back, he had spent $8 for gas. and we drove almost to Tennessee. So you don't do that anymore. But anyway, on this trip, it has nothing to do with what I'm talking about here. We were driving along and saw this little roadside zoo. So we stopped at this roadside zoo, and he had different animals of different kinds, and mainly what he had were animals that were native to the particular area. But he also had animals, like he had a dog that had 5 legs. You have animals that are born with 3 legs. You have, and that's a mutation. That's where something mutated in the genes that caused that. Well, according to evolution, mutation is one of their main causes that they go back to for evolution. They say that it mutated into this, and give you, this is an extreme example, but for instance, animal wanted to get the vegetation they were eating got to where it was up taller, so they had to start stretching up to eat. So the next generation mutated with longer necks, or where they could stand on their hind feet, or different. In other words, mutation caused this because they adapted to their environment. Yes. And that's how they say a giraffe got. How many more vertebrae is in the neck of a giraffe than is in your neck? None. The same amount. Same amount. Did you know that if a giraffe's head's way up here, if he bends over to get water, now he has to have a heart that's about this big to pump blood to his brain. If he bends over to drink water and that pump blood into his brain at the same force, he'd explode his brain. He would die. He wouldn't get one drink of water. You know why it doesn't? When he puts his head down, there's valves that kind of slow down the flow, and there's a sponge-like material in his brain that absorbs what's there, so it won't explode his brain. And according to evolutionists, that's just mutations of something that happened before that got to the point where this giraffe could do that. That's pretty smart stuff. But anyway, and they say natural selection, like they'll say natural selection is a bird with if you have to have a longer beak, for instance, to get food out of this particular area, then you'll slowly mutate, and they'll begin to evolve and adapt with a longer beak so they can get what's in there out. Well, I think it's the reverse. I think it's genetics. For instance, if you took, back before there was air conditioners and heat and all this kind of stuff, if you had a group of 20 people, you had some that were black, some that were brown, some that were all different shades, and you had some that were real white. And all of them moved to where the Scandinavian countries are. After a few generations, all you would have is the real white people. Is that because they mutated? No, that's because the darker your skin, the more hours of daylight you have to get enough vitamin D to keep you alive. So those people that carried the darker genes would be the first ones that started getting unhealthy, and they would start dying, and the ones that survived would be the lighter skinned ones. In reverse, if you take them all and move them down into where it's all sun most all the time, the people with the light skin would get skin diseases and sunburns, and they would start dying off. So to me, I look at it opposite from what the people in evolution do. I think it's genetically, that's what happens. What can't survive, that's kind of natural selection. But anyway, but that's what they attribute it to. They say these are the reasons why gene flow and genetic drift. I'm going to give a simple example that's horrible, and if any science teacher were to hear this, they would say, Randy, that's a stupid example, but I'm going to use it anyway. You have 10 people just move, they get to this deserted island, and they can't get off. There's one redhead, and everybody else has black hair. There are no other civilizations that ever come in contact with them, so what happens to the redhead? Eventually, that genetic trait will be weeded out over a period of time because the majority of them are dark-haired. Now, if you take all 10 of them and they landed on an island where there were 10 other people and they were all blonde, what would happen? Then you get a mix of whatever you had in all of them, because you wouldn't have the minority trait down here as disappearing. You would have it become more blended together, and that's the simplest way I know how to explain gene flow and genetic drift. Recombination, we're not even going to talk about. The truth of causality is so substantiated that it is taken for granted in scientific investigation. The goal of scientific experimentation is to determine what will happen, what will be the effect, if one does certain things, initiates certain causes. So in other words, you do experimentation with what you have. You want to get to a certain point, you have an idea, you have a hypothesis, so you do certain things to see if your hypothesis is true. So if I do this, this didn't happen, so this doesn't cause this. That's the simplified way of putting it. If there were no relationship between cause and effect, then nothing could be taken for granted. And the example I got here is one day gravity would work one way and then the next day it wouldn't. So if it was gravity didn't always work the same way, if you woke up in the morning and you were on the ceiling, you'd know not to go outdoors because no telling where you'd wind up. But we know that we can trust gravity is going to work the same all the time. So we know there's a cause and effect. We know that we can study certain things and learn certain things because they happen the same way over and over and over. They're consistent. Moving further into the 20th century, the law of cause and effect still had not been repealed. In 1949, Albert Einstein, in The World as I See It, under the heading, The Religiousness of Science, wrote this: "But the scientist is possessed by the sense of universal causation." So we know this is true, and they admit this is true. The Encyclopedia of Philosophy, renowned American philosopher and professor Richard Taylor wrote, "Nevertheless, it is hardly disputable that the idea of causation is not only indispensable in the common affairs of life, but in all applied sciences as well." So, what am I getting at? Scientists, whether they're evolutionists or creationists or somewhere in between, they agree with the idea of cause and effect. Okay? Except that is the truth. Today's dictionary defines causality as the principle that nothing can happen without being caused. Isn't that sensible? Makes sense to us. The principle that everything has a cause. National Academy of Sciences guidebook teaching about evolution in the natural sciences says one goal of science is to understand nature. In fact, if you go back and start studying some of the first scientists that began to study nature, many of them, if not most all of them, were believers. They believed in God and they were interested in what caused all this to happen, and they started creating the different lines of science that we have today. Understanding in science means relating one natural phenomenon to another and recognizing the causes and effects of the phenomena. Progress in science consists of the development of better explanations for the causes of natural phenomena. Isn't it something how you can start out people understanding and realizing? You read back in like we were reading from the book of Job, when God was questioning Job, and we're talking about the foundations of everything and about where it came from and so on, that back then they realized it was God, but the smarter we get, the less that people believe in God. It gets so smart that they don't need God. Notice that according to the National Academy of Science, there can be no progress in science without causality. What is the point? The law of causality is a problem for atheists. It's a problem for them, but not a problem to us. Evolutionary astronomer Robert Jastrow As Einstein said, scientists live by their faith in causation and the chain of cause and effect. Every effect has a cause that can be discovered by rational arguments. Okay, so far I agree with him. And this has been a very successful program, if you will, for unraveling the history of the universe. But it just fails at the beginning. So time really going backward comes to a halt at that point. What is this evolutional astronomer saying? He's saying that cause and effect, they study it, and all of it, they have confidence in it. Einstein, all of them have confidence in it, and they can follow it through, and they can follow it back. They say, this is here because of this, and 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 then all of a sudden, you run into a brick wall. Where did the energy and matter come from? How did all of it happen? How did it get here to start? They believe in cause and effect, so they study using cause and effect, but sooner or later you go back far enough, you have to get to the point, well, where did energy come from? Where did matter come from? Where did intelligence come from? Where did all this come from? Speech. I'm talking and you're listening, and for the most part you can understand what I'm saying. Right? You take a baby that's born, they can't talk. You give them just a few years, by the time they're 40 years, not 40, by the time they're 4 years old, they can carry on a conversation. Did you sit Marley down and teach her English and get out the English textbooks and explain to her what a noun and a verb was and an adjective and an adverb, and you didn't do it, but she learned how to talk? Okay, if you were to take one of us, any of us, if we were to go into a room full of people that spoke German, and we stayed there for 4 years, and they never told us anything about what they were talking about, and we just heard them talking, we would pick up a little bit, but we wouldn't learn a lot about the language unless we studied it. But a baby, a little kid, can pick up language from just listening to people around them talking and observation. Pardon me?
Fast and in a hurry.
In a hurry, and they start learning that, and they start picking it up, and they start speaking. It had to come from somewhere. But this cause and effect, he's saying the scientists go back, but sooner or later they come to a point where they run into a wall. Beyond that, the curtain can never be lifted. He says it can never be lifted. And that is really a blow at the very fundamental premise that motivates all scientists. In other words, he can't stop long enough to think, well, you know, there might be a creator out there somewhere. And this intelligent creator might have started all this. And that's the reason last week when we were talking about it, I said you have to make a distinction between atheistic evolution and theistic evolution. Because there are people, atheistic evolutionists, believe there is no God, there's never been a God, everything just came about on its own, everything just happened on its own, where a theistic evolutionist will believe in God, but they believe that God started everything going, and then evolution is the way that he used to get to mankind and to get everything on earth the way it is today. So we have to be careful when we're talking about them, but when you're looking at an atheistic evolutionist, they run into this problem. The scientific community today, by and large, defines science in such a way that anything supernatural cannot be considered scientific, and therefore science fails in certain areas. In other words, if you're an atheist, you have to do away with any idea, any concept of the supernatural. You won't even consider the fact of something in the supernatural causing something that has happened here. That creates a problem. Merriam-Webster on scientific methods says, this is their definition, principles and procedures for the systematic pursuit of knowledge involving the recognition and formulation of a problem, the collection of data through observation and experiment, and the formulation and testing of the hypothesis. In other words, this is the way through science, the way you do things. In other words, you get down to the point where you can use observation and experimentation to see if what you're thinking works will work. Jastrow wrote, the one we just talked about, the universe and everything that has happened in it since the beginning of time are a grand effect without a known cause. Are you beginning to see how cause and effect creates a problem for atheists? They believe it happens up to a certain point. Jeff Miller, PhD, an effect without a known cause? That is not the world of science. It is the world of witchcraft, of wild events, and the whims of demons, a medieval world that science has tried to banish. In other words, if you believe in a effect without a cause, then that's nothing more than witchcraft. Scientists and philosophers recognize that there must be a cause that would be sufficient to bring about matter and the universe, and yet no natural cause is known. Is what he said. The McGraw-Hill Dictionary of Scientific and Technical Terms says that causality in physics is the principle that an event cannot precede its cause. However, the atheist must concede that in order for his claim to be valid, the effect of the universe did not precede its cause. Rather, it actually came about without it. Such a viewpoint is hardly in keeping with science. In other words, their own method and what they call scientific theory and the way of discovering truth, their own definition and their own way of doing that defeats what they say actually happened, because they say there was no antecedent cause, cause that brought about this effect. Why do some scientists accept the law of causality in some areas and reject it in others? Why did they do that? Because they don't want to believe it, mainly. If nothing can be found within the universe as a cause, maybe there is a reason outside the limits of the universe. Now, that would be something to consider, wouldn't it? If you can't find anything which evolutionists have not been able to, nobody in science has ever have been able to find anything within the universe that started everything into being. They can't find it. So the natural assumption as a scientist would be, well, maybe there's something outside of our known world, outside of our universe. Maybe there's something outside of that we could consider in order to be the beginning point. I put this, I had an atheistic evolutionist when asked where it all began and how, that is not without the study of evolution, but in the field of abiogenesis. I said, well, as an evolutionist, aren't you curious? Instead of saying, when I asked him where matter and energy and all this come from, he said, that's not in the field of evolution. This abiogenesis is where that is. So I looked it up. A theory in the evolution of early life on Earth, organic molecules and subsequent simple life forms first originated from inorganic substances. Okay, what does that leave out? He says this is the study of the beginning of where it all came from. What does the definition leave out? He says life forms first originated from inorganic substances. The question that comes to my mind is, where did the inorganic substances come from? Wouldn't that be a logical question? So he sent me to this, but this doesn't answer my question. If you were to follow the evidence wherever it leads, rather than defining God out of science, one is led to the unavoidable conclusion that there must be someone supernatural that caused the universe to be. Supernatural. Now, when you think of supernatural, what do you think? When you think of something supernatural, anything that's supernatural. Pardon me?
Unexplainable.
Unexplainable. When you think about, if you say, they just made a movie and it has to do with the supernatural. Some of it could be like The Walking Dead, ghosts, poltergeists, all kinds of things like this. This is things that you would think of when you're talking about the supernatural. Well, it's kind of, what does supernatural mean? I don't know who's trying to call me. It doesn't matter, they hung up. There are basic questions that naturalistic science has yet to be able to answer. Where did the first matter come from? Where did energy come from? Where did intelligence come from? There's more than that, but let's just go with those. If one were to follow the evidence wherever it leads, rather than defining God out of science, one is led to the unavoidable conclusion that there must be someone supernatural that caused the universe to be. In every material, natural, effect must have a cause, and a natural cause would contradict the available evidence. Then the ultimate cause of the universe must be supernatural. Hebrews, it said that I read to begin with, every house is built by someone, but he who built all things is God. Scientifically speaking, according to the law of cause and effect, there had to be a cause for the universe. And that is the essence of the cosmological argument that we're talking about for the existence of God. In other words, when you're looking at the evidence lines up on our side better than it does when it comes to cause and effect than it does on the evolutionist side. Emil Borel, and you can read all the things about him, he says, now the complexity of the brain must therefore have been even richer than the particular work to which it gave birth. In other words, God is smarter than us. Have you all realized that? He was smart enough to create us and to make us like we are. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and empty. It says, in the beginning was God. It doesn't tell you where God came from. It tell you how God came about. No, it says, it just made a statement. In the beginning, God created. The effect of the brain's existence, like a work of literature, must have an adequate cause. So if we have our brains that can operate like they do, then we would have to, just like if you're reading a book, you didn't think that book just wound up on your shelf one day and just happened out of nothing, that somebody with some intellect had to write that book, research it, and put it down on paper. In the same way, we know that the infinite mind behind the creation of this infinitely complex universe had to be and was more than adequate for the task of bringing it into existence. Uncaused cause? But if everything had to have a beginning, why does the same concept not apply to God? Doesn't God need a cause too? Who caused God? And that's what evolutionists have asked me. When I asked them, where did the first material and energy and intelligence come from? They said, well, you have the same problem. Where did God come from? Well, how would you answer them? How did God come into existence? Why wouldn't God have to have somebody that caused him? If you believe in cause and effect, why wouldn't God have to have a cause in order to have the effect, which was God? First, notice that this statement is based on an understanding that the law of cause and effect claims concerning the universe. The law states that every material effect, and notice underline that, every material effect must have an adequate antecedent or simultaneous cause. The law of science is determined through the observation of nature, not supernatural nature. When you say supernatural, we have it all as one word, and we get certain things that pop in our head when we think supernatural. But if you break the word down, it's supernature. Supernature is something outside of nature. Since they have no observed the supernatural realm, scientists cannot apply the scientific law of causality to it. In other words, the same law does not apply because you're talking about something that's outside of nature. It's outside of what we understand, outside of everything that's here, outside of the physical. Everything in science is based on observation and experimentation with the natural, what is of nature. How does one do experiments on beings outside of nature? The answer is you can't. All you can do is what we go with is what we have. So everything that goes by the law, and let me put it this way, naturalistic evolution from an atheistic level says that everything is cause and effect, that this had to happen in order for this to happen, in order for this to happen. We as believers believe that there's God who is outside of time, who is outside of nature. Why is it that God can know what happened infinitely in the past and know what's going on in the future? It's because God is outside of time. He's not constrained by time the way that we are. We say 1,000 years to God is not very long. Well, 1,000 years to God is nothing because time doesn't exist in God's world. Does that make sense? Probably not. Where did all matter, all energy, intelligence come from? We would posit that God made it, and atheists may respond with who made God. A good response would be in the form of a question. According to your theory, where did the first matter come from? In other words, get them to answer the question, where did the first matter come from? And I saw these headlines in Ford magazine. It says, scientists may have solved mystery of matter's origin. Okay, so I decided to read the article. Wouldn't that be the obvious thing to do? From the article. But the gist of their theory is simple, even poetic. The conditions of the early universe were biased toward creating something out of nothing. Does that answer the question? It said it was biased. What do you mean it was biased? And this, to develop this explanation, study authors Alexander Kosenko, Lauren Pierce, and Louis Yang had to delve deep into the universe's origins. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. Roughly 1 decillionth. Okay, do you know what a decillion is? Okay, you have ones, you have tens, you have hundreds, you have thousands, you have millions, you have billions, you have trillions, you have quadrillions, then you have quintillions, then you have sextillions, then you have septillions, octillions, nonillions, then decillions. So that's how big, how they're saying 1 decillionth of a second. That's tiny. After the Big Bang, okay, what did they assume right off the bat? That there was a Big Bang. Okay, this article is going to tell us where everything came from and how matter originated. Is starting out with the Big Bang. How do you have a Big Bang without something to bang? If you don't have energy already, if you don't have matter already, if you don't have something in existence, you can't have a Big Bang. But but these brilliant scientists have come up with this. In this period termed inflation, particles, the most basic ingredient of everything in the universe, okay, particles, and antiparticles, the opposite of all that coexisted. So here we go. Now first, they had a Big Bang. They didn't tell us where the energy or anything came for the Big Bang or what created the Big Bang and how it came about. And now they've also all of a sudden posited that there's particles and antiparticles. Well, where did they come from? You're not telling me where things began. You're telling me after things started, but you're not telling me that. It said the opposite of all that coexist in a rapidly expanding hot soup. A hot soup. Where did the hot soup come from? Where did the stuff come from? The two could switch identities, talking about matter and antimatter. In other words, antiparticles could turn into particles and vice versa. But the laws of physics applied equally both, meaning that they were created in perfect proportion. They even say that they were created in perfect proportion, and they're trying to, they just said there's a creator. These atheistic scientists who are trying to explain where matter came from have gotten right back to creation. I'm going to skip this one because we're running out of time. The theist could not have said it better than what he said. Well, let me go back and read this. This is important. If God, this is Michael Shermer. He's an atheist, by the way. If God is a being in space and time, it means that he is restrained by the laws of nature and the contingencies of chance, just like all other beings of this world. An omniscient and omnipotent God must be above such constraints. Now listen to what this atheist is saying. Must be above such constraints. No subject of nature and chance. God, as creator of heaven and earth and all things invisible, would need necessarily to be outside such created object. Isn't that what we believe? This evolution is trying to prove that God doesn't exist by saying exactly what we theists believe about God existing. Atheist versus theist answer to where the first matter came from based on just the before mentioned article. Atheist, where did the first matter come from? He said the conditions of the early universe were biased toward creating something out of nothing. They just say, well, that's just the way it was. They were biased towards it. Question, where did the conditions come from? Theist, where did the first matter come from? God made it. The problem remains for the atheist and the theist alike. How can a natural being observe and study beings and things outside the natural? So who has the better argument? A theist or an atheist when it comes to the cosmological argument? Let's see what else I got here. Consider, if we were to grant that the laws of science apply to the supernatural realm, then if there ever were a time in history when absolutely nothing existed, not even God, then nothing would continue to exist today, since nothing comes from nothing. If you were to take a room and put nothing in that room, and you did not put a chair in that room, would you expect to come back in 100 years and find a chair in that room? No. But it's always going to remain chairless because there's nothing that has put the chair in there. Do you have any questions or comments?